So in this video, I'm going to reveal the simple steps to setting up an epic Ableton template so that any level of musician and producer can totally transform their music making process. So here's what we're going to cover. Number one, how you can leverage Ableton's features to play it like an instrument. Number two, what the secrets behind an amazing setup are. And number three, practical tips to guide you to set up your own. Hey yo, it's Alex from My Music. I'm a musician, producer, and certified audio engineer here to help you finish professional sounding music that you love. All right, so let's talk about number one, how to leverage Ableton to its maximum potential and play it like an instrument, which I call it calibrating. Before we get there, why am I even doing this? Well, let me tell you a story. Just the other day, I was going through some samples on my computer and inside Ableton to curate the best ones and use them as my secret weapons, right? And as I was doing this, I realized the sheer magnitude of options that were available to me. Like, I am not kidding. Tens of thousands of options, samples, presets, virtual instruments, effects, instruments and hardware gear, and different ways of using them and connecting this is like, holy man, possibilities. And if I start to think about everything that is possible and all of these sheer amount of options, I tend to get overwhelmed. And funny enough, I'm not the only one who thinks so. I'm going to share this quote: "The absence of limitations is the enemy of art," by Orson Welles. Okay. And this is the quote that informs why I'm doing this. This is why I designed a system where this is stage one. Before I do anything, I reduce my options. I limit myself. I set intentional constraints so that when I get into making music, I don't have to waste my precious creative real estate and creative thinking, decision making to try and find good sounds. I've done that ahead of time so I can just dive in and start making music. So I'm removing friction later on in the process by kind of doing this ahead of time. And if you want your own copy of the template that I use to calibrate these instruments with all the action items laid out in there so you can follow along, you can design your own instruments with your setup. You do not need any specific gear. If you want that whole template along with all the other stages in the system that I use and teach my clients, you can grab it with the link in the description. Now that we got the why out of the way, let's focus on the what. Let's talk about what makes Ableton unique in my opinion. It's the fact that you can play it like an instrument. What the fuck does that mean? Well, beyond the typical like controlling software instruments with MIDI controllers, especially with Push, right? Or some other crazy controller like that, but I'm biased towards Push, you know what I'm saying? You can design your own instruments and jam with your ideas live. Okay, so let me show you what I mean. All right, so for example, you know what I'm saying? Like what we can do, very easy. You select a track, right? Let's say this bass track. Push automatically updates, super nice. And now I can play some bass, right? Let's say I want to play some drums. I'll just select a track that I know there's drums on. I have drums accessible to me. Let's say I want to play some piano. I hit that track. Beautiful, right? So you get immediate access to all of these sounds very quickly, right? Which is, you can do this with most DAWs. This is not exclusive to Ableton. But what I love about Ableton is that I have this whole section that I can loop ideas and play with them live. And the other thing is, especially with how Ableton works in terms of, let's, for example, say a drum rack, right? Where you're placing samples on pads, whether you have a pad controller, Push, if you're using a keyboard, you can lay out these different keys to trigger different pads. So it doesn't matter. You could even lay out different notes on your keyboard, this keyboard, because they're both keyboards, know what I'm saying? But you could actually map these keys on your keyboard, computer keyboard, to trigger pads as well. So it doesn't really matter what gear you have. There's always a solution to do this. But for example, I have this drum rack that I've laid out the pads symmetrically, okay? Because I found that way the easiest for me to play it. I come from playing drums in the past, and I like to be able to alternate my hands and have a symmetrical layout, right? So for example, if I play a beat with this, right? Like I got 2 kicks here, 2 snares, 2 hi-hats closed, 2 hi-hats open, and I can jam by like alternating my hands. Right? So I found that really easy. I can even get a jam going with one hand. right? So that becomes like muscle memory. And if I go ahead and bank up an octave, right? So I'll go to this other drum kit that is also a symmetrical layout, right? Different sounds, super easy to access. If I go up an octave, you'll notice that the layout of the pads are different, okay? And I want you to notice that this alone, okay, just the arrangement of your pads on a grid or even on your keyboard or controller, whatever it is, will change how you play the pads. It will change how you play the instrument, right? So since this isn't laid out like symmetrical, like I can't really play it like I did with this layout, right? But this gives me a new way of playing it. Well, I can just like move my fingers like this. Right? Get a beat like that, or do some sort of alternating pattern. Right? And I have all these different sounds. Right? So simply changing the layout of the pads will change how you interface with whatever you're playing, right? In this case, it's drums. So it's a different way to play the pads, right? Compared to the symmetrical layout, where this one I can just like move my fingers in a pattern, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? And get a cool beat. We'll talk about like this whole drum rack setup a little bit later, but I just wanted to emphasize that. And like if you're using something like Push or like a MIDI controller, most of them will have sequencing abilities with which adds another layer of possibility of how you can play these instruments. So in this case with Push, right, we have all these pads, but I can like sequence these by selecting a pad and sequencing them into a loop, right? So now I just got to kick on the one, right? Super easy. I can loop parts and then jam over them. There's like the repeat function. So I hold repeat. Now I'm repeating 8th notes, 16th notes, 32nd notes, right? There's so many different things. If you go to a melodic thing on Push, right? I have, let's say, let's go to the keyboard, right? I have this layout where I can play chords, but if I hit layout, right, I can now sequence notes in the timeline. Or if I wanted to, layout again, and I have half and half, right? So I could like find a cool major 7 chord and then program that into step 1 and 3. Right? And then let's say I wanted to change the length of the loop, hold layout, right? Maybe we just want this long. Right? So the possibilities are endless, and I'm sure you can start to see how, yeah, you're playing the DAW. You're not really programming in stuff with MIDI. Like you're playing it with your hands. You're getting in the nitty gritty. You're getting in flow, right? So this is exactly like an instrument, just a different way, right? It's just like a guitar, but it just has more features. On top of that, you can get in the real nitty gritty of the technical back end of what are called these racks in Ableton. And Ableton has instrument racks, drum racks, and audio effect racks. And let me just show you that real quick. So I'll go to Ableton here, right? And don't mind this. I'm just going to collapse these. I got 4 loopers. This is another video. If you want to see this whole crazy looper, 4 looper setup, guitar, crazy overdubbing madness, I'll link that video in the card above so that you can check that out. We'll save that for another time, right? So I'm going to quickly demo for you these different types of racks inside of Ableton and how it opens up so many doors, so many possibilities, so much functionality to really play Ableton like an instrument, customize it for whatever you want. And the first thing I want to highlight is the drum rack. So I'm going to go ahead and select this drum instrument, right? If I pop up my hands, you'll see that it populates here. Now, you don't need Push. Push is a nice controller. It was designed by Ableton. I love it. It's great for teaching, and I personally love it as an instrument, but you could also be using your computer keyboard. You could be using any old MIDI controller, and it will map itself to the cells in the drum rack, which we'll talk about right now. So if I go ahead and zoom in, right? So I have a drum rack right here where essentially each of these cells represent one of the pads on my controller, right? And if I hit that pad, you'll see that it triggers one of those cells. In this case, the most bottom left corner, the next one over, so on and so forth. So as you're doing this, it's super simple. You could just like go in your browser, grab a sample, right? Go over here, find something you like in your samples, right? Or something you downloaded online, find the sample, we'll X this out, and then you just click and drag it into one of these cells, and you can trigger it with something like Push or your keyboard controller or your computer keyboard, whatever you want, right? So that's super awesome and pretty simple, right? But here's where drum rack and the whole kind of Ableton ecosystem really starts to unfold. So in this case, there's all this other stuff on the right-hand side where it's like, what is all that stuff? They're called chains. Okay, so if I actually close this chain, there we go. There's a little option over here, this little tiny window, right? That is your chain view, right? So right now it's closed and it keeps it clean, right? But if I open this up, each of these cells can be triggering multiple sounds, right? So right here, you'll notice that when I trigger this little thing, boing, it plays both of these layers, right? It plays all of these layers actually, all three of these layers. And each of these layers are simply different samples. As you can see, this one, right, is like a kick drum. This one is a hi-hat. This one is an 808, right? Super low in the background. And those are all stacked together when I hit this pad, right? So it's layering to make it really powerful sounds instead of just using one sample. That's cool, but you can go even farther. If we crack open this chain, right, you'll notice that this chain has chains within it. Starts to get meta. Now we're going to get crazy here. I'm just going to close this, but I'll just show you what I mean. So that layer one right here, right, which is being triggered by this cell when I hit it. Same with layer two, same with the 808 layer. Like all three of these layers are being triggered by one pad. Cool. But in this one layer, right, we can have multiple different sounds. And in this case, right, we can have different settings, right? Maybe we go over here. This is a different sample, right? Over here, different sample. Over here, different sample, right? So you can have a bunch of samples and then decide which one you want this chain to trigger, right? So in this case, let's go with number one, right? So in this first layer of the three that are being triggered by one single pad, it has multiple options of other chains that can trigger. Let's just focus on number one for now. Inside this chain of number one, there is a device called a random device, which is outputting a different probability from three different options. As I hit this one pad, notice how the sound changes. Very subtly, right? Even here, this kick. Notice how every third time there's a hi-hat. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? So by designing this type of instrument, right, you can see how much more expressive this is, where I literally just hit one pad and the sound is changing. Right? Fuse it with another one. You can get some crazy polyrhythms. You can get some expressivity. It grows your ability to play and get in flow and get cool results sonically from your instruments just by virtue of how you design them. All right, next I want to break down what an instrument rack can look like, and I'll link below the devices. You can purchase these devices, and that's what I like to do, is buy them and then dissect them to understand them and then use them as inspiration to design my own. So shout out to Production Labs, shout out to Playground, shout out to Studio Sensei. I'll link it down below if you want to check out those devices, okay? But for this one, this is the Production Labs one. And let's crack it open. But we basically just have an instrument rack. So I'm just going to simplify this. But basically in this one, there's no effects going on except for this chain selector, which we'll talk about right now. So I'm just going to minimize that. All you got to know is the only control that we got in this macro control for this instrument is this chain selector. So that's the only thing, versus this other one. We have a reverb, we have a delay, we have ping pong, we have all these effects, right? So for now, I'm just going to minimize that window and focus on the instruments. So now inside here, I'm going to open up the chain. Okay, right now it's hidden, but we're going to open up the chain. And now you can see that we have different areas that we can move this chain selector through, and wherever this chain selector overlaps with the selected area, that will be the instrument that plays, right? So for example, if I go over the classic Rhodes and I play my MIDI controller, notice how it plays that instrument, right? But now if I move right? If I go over my hands here. So just to demo this with this instrument, right? This is what the sound is. This nice kind of Rhodes belly sound. And now if I move this control, which is that chain selector, right? I will move to a different area and I'll be playing a different instrument. So now if I go back to Ableton, let's zoom into the bottom and let me show you what this is. So what's actually happening is that when I'm moving this knob on my controller, it's moving this chain selector, and depending where the overlap is of this chain selector and the area beside the instrument, that's what we'll be playing. So in this case, now if I play my controller, we'll be playing the smooth tight instrument, right? This one. Right? And maybe we want to go into the instrument itself and open up the decay time, right? So we have a little bit more time. Now, if I go back over here and move the chain selector to the next instrument, guess what? Now we're going to be playing the noisy Rhodes. If I move over to the next one, now we're playing a different instrument, right? So on and so forth, right? There's quite a few instruments in this instrument rack. But what this does, if I go back to my overhead, is that with one interface, right? This can be push, this could be a keyboard controller, right? This could be anything that you're using to control an instrument in an instrument rack. If you map the chain selector to a control, right? And then you have multiple instruments that you've set up, you can have multiple instruments with one device. Cool beans. Finally, I want to nerd out about the last type of rack in Ableton, which is an audio effect rack. Okay, so right now I'm just going to double click on this to minimize it, and we'll actually just focus on this guy. So this is basically just a container for multiple effects to live in. Now, same as always, this top button over here, right, will be your macro controls. If I hit this, all of those 8 macro controls disappear. I hit it again, they open up. You can add more. You can remove them if you want, right? Then we have macro variations, which maybe we could save that for another video. Let me know if you want to see that in the comments down below. But then we have our chain selector here, right? And basically what this is doing is there is just filtration happening depending on if the frequencies are in the mid-range to high frequencies or the low frequencies, right? So if I zoom back out here and we look over here at the device chain, right? We can see that this chain has an EQ that's filtering out everything below, looks like about 100 hertz, okay? So all these effects, the compressor, the grain delay, the amplifier, the auto wah, etc., are all affecting only the mid-range and the high frequencies, okay? So therefore, when we map controls, like you can see that he's mapped the chorus on off, the dry wet of the chorus. He's mapped the dry wet of the auto wah. He's mapped the dry wet of the amplifier, etc. to these macro controls. Just know that those effects are only going to be affecting that frequency range with whatever instrument this effect rack is on top of, right? Now, if I go ahead and click this next rack, right, the low end rack, let's open it up here, right? There's actually no processing going on in the low end, right? So right now he has an EQ that's filtering everything above 100 hertz, right? So now this is just the low end being untouched. And you'll notice that on this chain that there are no effects, right? Which is a very smart move. So basically in this audio effect rack with this kind of wizardry happening behind the scenes, we are only applying the effects and the processing and the amplification and the auto wah, all the stuff that we're controlling here, the chorus, the resonance, all this kind of stuff, the drive, the trippiness, whatever that is. It might be a combination of effects. It's only affecting the mid-range and the high frequencies, okay? And the low end is remaining untouched. And that's a good move because sometimes the low end doesn't respond to effects the same way that it does in the mid-range and the high mids, right? So again, you can get super customized with how you set up your effects and make sure that they're sounding good. And this is really what I want to drive home, is that if you take the time to design these things in a way that sounds good to you, that is already most of the way there in terms of optimization, where you're only processing the high frequencies, or you have special effects only happening on the low end. You have instrument racks with all your favorite presets or all of your favorite patches that you've made. You have drum racks with samples that you like already loaded. and you arrange it on the pad instrument or whatever instrument that you're playing with in a way that's intuitive to you. And then maybe you add in some extra variation where every time you hit the pad, it swaps between a different sample with those chains. You can start to see how you create instruments and a way to perform with Ableton that then when you want to make music and you want to flow and just jam out stuff, that your instruments that you're playing with are so much more expressive and dialed in right off the bat, which just gets you into flow so much easier. Now, there's a zillion ways you can design instruments, but that's not all you can do with Ableton. I come from playing instruments, jamming guitar, jamming bass, playing drums in bands, etc. And I enjoy improvising to discover cool ideas instead of always orchestrating parts. I usually do that later on in the creative process. Now, Ableton is designed for live performance, hence why it's called Ableton Live. With its session view, you can trigger clips and perform them almost like a DJ, but you can leverage these performance features for idea generation as well. This totally blew my mind when I first discovered this because Ableton is an instrument bro. So let me show you a quick example with Push. As I'm recording these clips into session view, I can actually output whatever I'm jamming to arrangement view at the same time. Okay. Doing this, I'm essentially recording the loops I create live and the automation of how I perform them into arrangement view. Okay. So let me go ahead and demo that to you. All right. So we're back in Ableton here and I have session view highlighted in my screen here. And I got my overhead of the controllers. And we're going to show you what I mean by Ableton transforming into an instrument. Okay, so right now in Ableton, I have all these tracks that have different instruments on them. And you'll notice that we have these clip slots, right? So if I record a loop in there, it's just going to loop itself over and over until I tell it to stop, right? And then you can overdub on this stuff. There's a bunch of cool stuff you can do, but the basic premise is that you can record loops into these slots, okay? And these slots are actually also represented right here on my controller. So instead of me having to go in here and clicking here to record a new loop on this bass track, for example, I can simply hit this button, which represents that clip, okay? So we're gonna play around with that, but I wanna highlight one of the best things that I've discovered in Ableton for my flow and how I love doing things is that when we hit tab in Ableton here, we move over to a typical timeline view, right? Arrangement view. So what we can do is as we're jamming out clips and we're looping things and we're having fun, right? We can also be outputting what we're doing into the timeline. Okay, which makes it so much easier to go in there and edit, because one thing that I always say to my clients and my students, and I keep in mind for myself, is that if you're getting stuck in the loop and you're having trouble arranging tracks, it's a lot easier to put stuff in the timeline and see it as the marble that you will then chisel away at later. Because if we're thinking about creative psychology, it is so much easier to make decisions with something, even if it's something you don't like, right? It's so much easier to be like, I actually don't like this part of the arrangement. This goes too long. And that's actually helping you make creative decisions because you're not staring at a blank DAW, right? So it's like creating the marble that you'll chisel away at later. So it's all good, man. Just like let it flow and jam out some ideas. And then you can remove most of it if you don't like it. But the thing is, you'll be way ahead of the game instead of being stuck in loops. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and demo this to you, just a few simple examples. Okay, so you can see the power of leveraging Ableton like an instrument. So I'm just gonna go back to session view here. Okay, and again, if we look at my controllers, whatever track I select here, that will be the instrument that pops up on push, right? So right here we have a bass, here I have another bass sound, right? Over here I have a drum kit, a second drum kit, right? Then over here I have a melodic instrument. Over here I have kind of a harmonic instrument, right? Over here we got some samples and some good organic goodness. And then over here we have the piano. Okay, so I'm just gonna keep things simple and show you how I tend to leverage things as I'm jamming. All right, so I worked out a progression that I kind of dig, right? I'm gonna use that just to keep things simple so that I'm not stumbling around, just to demonstrate this to you guys, okay? So the progression looks and sounds like this, something like this. Back home. All right, so I adjusted the tempo. I played around with it. We're at like 160 now. So what I'm going to do again is we're going to tab over. Okay, I'm going to select everything, delete it. That's definitely not what I wanted. There we go. Let's go to the beginning. And on my controller, I have an arrange record button right here, but that's the same as hitting this big red guy. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So the clock's going to be running, and we're just recording to arrangement, whatever's happening in session view. Okay, so I'm going to hit back over. It's all good if we didn't hit the downbeat. No worries. I'm going to go back to my piano. Gonna get the count down, and we'll go ahead and start. Okay. 2, 2, 3, 4. Da, da, da. Let's go and do this. Now that's looping, right? I can turn off the click. And as that's looping, if I go back to arrangement view, it's still recording in that loop, okay? So that's going, we got a vibe, right? Maybe we add some effects, go to our sends. Right, and then to keep things simple, I'm gonna go to my drums, okay, and we're gonna record something super simple. I'm gonna select my kick, I'm just gonna put kicks on these counts. Cool. Now, while we're jamming here, instead of adding layers to this pattern, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate this. So now I have a second clip, right, that has this kick pattern in it. So now we'll add some hi-hats, right? So let's select the hi-hat, right? Let's go over here. Right, pretty quick. Maybe we add some extra hi-hats here. Let's go here. There's a vibe, cool. Now again, I'll duplicate this. So now I have a third clip, right? Or let's go ahead and add a snare. So let's select this. Kind of weird, like stagger beat. Cool. So now I got 3 ideas that I can jam with. Let's say I go back to the kick here. Right? And then maybe you want to add a new one. Right, so now we're creating a new clip for our drum kit. I'm just gonna do the kick, but just more slow. There we go, right? So now, maybe we go to our bass, right? Go the sound that we like. And let's just do something super simple and hit the root note. So we'll wait till the progression goes around. And let's get it. Loopy can control the volume. Right, now we can maybe play around with some effects. Right, then get this drum kit, let's just have a jam. let's say I didn't like that first half. All good. Let's just select the second half. Right, there's a vibe. Play with some Master Effects. Right, so I'm just gonna stop it now. Stop it now. We could continue going. You could see how easy it is to get into flow with this time of setup. If we go back to arrangement, you'll see that we printed out our whole performance here, right? So sometimes it's like, it was the first variation of our drums, and I went to the second and the third. And as I was working parts out live, all of that live stuff and mistakes and all get recorded right into here. But as you're jamming, right, if something magical happens when you're like turning knobs and you play a part and you're like, wow, that was amazing. Guess what? You captured it, right? So that's the beauty of really taking Ableton and its guts and bringing it out into the physical world so that you can play with it in real time. And this is really such a game-changing thing for ideation and staying in flow, right? Because oftentimes, and I was guilty of this for a long time, right? But oftentimes when you're making something, right, you'll stop the flow to try and make it better. You'll stop the flow to try and edit. You'll stop, be like, oh, I don't know if this is a good idea or not. And what I have found to be way more useful and way more conducive to creative insights and breakthroughs and having fun is to keep the thing rolling, right? Like if you have mistakes, it's all good, right? Like if something doesn't work, it's all good. If you want to edit something, like try to do it in a way that's fun and flowy, right? So that's one thing to consider, that instead of hyper obsessing over tweaking things as you're creating, just focus on creation. So if you haven't played around with this type of thing before, I hope you can see how this can really open up the way that you interact with your ideas, how you jam them out, how you stay in flow, etc. And there's a zillion ways that you can set this up and make it work for you, right? You do not need this kind of gear. There's a zillion ways you can do it, right? But a few things I want to point out that are super helpful, or that I found helpful with this type of thing, is like when you're jamming in session view, right? It's helpful to create multiple versions of an idea so that you can manipulate them in real time. So for example, if I just solo the drums here, right? And I play our first variation, we have a fast kick pattern, right? Very simple. But let's say later on in the jam, I want to slow it down a bit. So maybe I go over here. Sorry, that's the one with the hi-hat. So maybe we want the hi-hat, go back to the kick, right? You can change that in real time as you're playing another instrument, right? Maybe you go over here, you add the snare, right? That weird stagger beat. And then maybe we want to slow it down, right? So you have variations that you can play with in real time. So that's an advantage of when you're jamming and you're in the flow, right? If we go back to session view here, okay? Like you can have different variations of a part, different parts of your drum groove, something with a hi-hat, something with a cool snare displacement, a slower kind of groove, etc. So that when you're in the heat of the moment and you're jamming, right, you have variations to call upon, right? You could stop the drums altogether, you could solo the drums, you could change the clip as you're jamming out other ideas, which will help you get different ideas going, right? Same thing goes for, if we look at our chords over here, right? Like I had a pretty complete chord progression where I was playing, let's unsolo this. I was playing these bigger chords with extensions. Something like that in the lower register, right? And those are pretty open voicings with some cool voice leading going on, right? But I could play just the simple triads to have a simplistic version of this progression. So it could just be like, there's our major triad. There's our major three, sorry. Right, so I could have another variation instead of this guy. Let's solo it instead of this. Right, I could have one that's more simple. So if I stop this and maybe record another one here, get the click going. A simple variation, and then when I want to whip out the complex one, And there's some automation going on with my master there, so don't worry about that. But basically breaking it down so that you have different variations in terms of complexity, in terms of groove, in terms of feel, etc., that you can call upon in real time, because maybe the more simple chord variation will allow more space for you to jam a melody on top, right? And then maybe the one with the voice leading and the more open chords are more for if you have rhythmic stuff going on, or if you want a pad in the background, or if that's your chorus, etc. But you get that all on the fly while you're jamming. All right, so the beautiful thing here is that I can mix and match these things live and perform this as I'm generating ideas. Plus, I can control the mixer controls, right? So the pan is up here. If I go to pan, I can go left and right. I have my sends. I have like 7 different sends that I can send these tracks to in real time. I have the on off for these tracks, right? You could turn off the drums, you could turn off the bass, you could solo it, etc. You can do all of these different things in real time, and all of the automation, like you just saw earlier with my master, right? All of the automation of turning on tracks and soloing things and maybe playing with some of your sends and panning things left to right will be recorded as automation, okay, into arrangement view. So I'm sure that you can start to see the power of this now. So then when you go back to Ableton, you had your jam session, right? You go back to arrangement view, right? You're going to have all of these tracks with some performance, with some automation, with like mixer controls going on, with sends going on and off, right? And most of it might not be great, and that's totally fine, right? Like a lot of it might not sound good, but there might be some magical moments. And the key is that you've captured it all in a structure that's like ready to be arranged instead of just in loops. It's a very different thing than just having a collection of loops here that are kind of not committed. It forces you to commit to something, even if it's something that isn't great, because from there, you can chisel it away. Now, this setup is great for me, but it's all for nothing if you don't have the exact same gear as me and the same musical background and the same taste. So that's exactly what we'll cover next, is how to make this work for yourself. All right, so let's move on to number 2, what the secrets behind an amazing setup are. And to set something up like this that really works for you, you have to find the right tools and the technical setup for the job. But how do you find the right things, right? How do you find the things that work for you? Here's the secret to finding the right tools, plugins, sounds, and gear to use. It's to establish a very strong vision and direction for your music. In my case, I'm focusing on my next album because I just finished my first ever solo album, so stay tuned for that. But the direction I want to go musically is like side dub, trippy, ambient with psychedelic guitars, looping my guitar, throwing Eastern instrumentation in there, cool organic textures, right? Cool organic sounding samples, and an overall chill and exploratory vibe that might get a little bit crazy and chromatic once in a while. But that's kind of the direction I want to go. And I do have some artists and combination of artists that I know I want to kind of combine what they're doing with my own style. I also have very specific things that I'd like to practice through the process of creating this album, because in my mind, I use the target of finishing a body of work as not only a goal in it of itself, but it's also the catalyst to help you practice and develop the skills that you want to develop. So in my case, I want to practice live looping in Ableton with clips, as well as live looping my guitar. I want to practice creating my own sampled instruments as well from whatever I can find and get my hands on, and create my own custom drum racks. And I want to explore jazz harmony, impressionistic kind of motifs, and just in general modal harmony, right? So those are things that I really am inspired by right now and that I want to explore. So with that direction mapped out, and by the way, I walk you through the exact exercise in the PDF that comes with the template if you want to follow along and outline this stuff for yourself. You can grab it in the description below. But once I've done this, I have the framing and the intentional constraints to help me make decisions as to what I'd like to do. And more importantly, how to make it happen and what tools you need to make it happen. So in general, I usually limit myself to 4 instruments, being rhythm, bass, melody, and harmony, but I broke my own rule this time, okay? I have a simplistic version of this because this is pretty CPU intensive and it can get a little bit overwhelming if you're jamming and there's too much stuff going on. So I always encourage people start simple and then build up from there. But this is how I have it set up so far. So let me give you a little tour of the setup. All right. So let me walk you through what I got set up in my Ableton template here. Okay. So again, I usually keep it more simple than this. I usually limit it to 4 tracks, maybe 5. In this case, I have more, but if you're just starting out, keep it simple to start, right? And really, this is just, maybe I have 2 tracks for the same element, but I'm really simplifying what I'm doing here. Okay. All right. So on this single bass instrument, I have an arpeggiator. I have master controls over the different sound that I'm playing. So I have, again, that chain selector going through different instruments that are all very similar in vibe, but just slightly different articulations, wavetable position, got an extra octave we can mix in there, filter, decay, glide, etc. So that we have hands-on control that changes the way we perform this, right? If I change the filter, right, we can open it up, we can turn up the glide, right? I can make notes kind of go into each other, which will change the parts you come up with. And then I have some effects that I put on most of my tracks, right? Where I have a glitch effect, I have a tear, just like a frequency modulation, erode, add some noise, grind, distorts it a little bit, reduce, bit crusher, right? FM stuff, trippy delay, huge reverb, etc., right? So over time, if you use the same effects, it starts to become muscle memory, right? Where you know where things are. And that's essentially the setup I have for this first bass instrument. For the second one, it's way more simple. This is kind of just a stab, right? Where I can change the sound, of course, go down, right? And I can change the articulation. Maybe we want a faster release, so that it takes time for it to come in, right? Maybe we want to shorten this, right? So it's a really quick transient. This will change the way you play versus this, right? So super simple here. I don't have many effects on this. This is just an extra layer to do some call and response with the other bass track. Okay, so bass on track 2. Let's go to track 3. Basically, this is my electronic drum kit where I have a really juicy kick, right? Some crazy snare. I can change out the sample of each of these hits individually. So let's say I want to change this kick sound. I can just change it here, right? Let's say I want to change this kick sound to something else, right? Then I have 2 different kick sounds, which can be really cool and really fun, right? So independent control on changing the samples of each pad on this drum kit. And then on top of that, we have our typical effects, the same ones that I had on the bass, right? That I can play with in real time. And yeah, that's about it. Essentially a little bit of, EQ and volume control as well if needed. But I also have all the mixer controls here, right? For volume. You can fade it in here. I can solo, mute, use the sends, pans, etc., right? So that's my more electronic sounding drum kit, because that's kind of the direction I want to explore. A little bit more electronic. The kind of music I've made in the past has always had more realistic sounding drums and organic stuff. So I'm kind of exploring a little bit more sound design, electronic stuff. And my other drum kit is essentially a little bit more of the organic side of things, right? So it's similar layout. Right? Jamming out on that stuff, fun times. And if I play one of these samples, you'll see that kind of cyclic thing going on where I think it alternates between 3 samples every time, right? So notice every third hit, there's a hi-hat here. 1, 2. Right? So that adds some randomization. It adds some realness, some, chaos, a little bit of off the grid. You can't really predict it, which is nice contrast versus the electronic, like super on the grid, right? So a little bit of live drums. This one I have a little bit of a different effect rack where I can add like bit crusher, right? Low pass over here, reverb, right? These all sound really good. We got a like a weird tape scratching thing going on, right? Distortion, etc. And then again, we got hands-on control to the layers, right? Different 808 volume. We can change the saturation type, etc., etc., etc. So hands-on control to play this in real time, right? Because if you have like access to a bit crusher, you're going to get a unique part. It's It's going to change the way you play it, right? All right, next I have a melodic instrument that I can go through different sounds once again with that instrument rack. And this one's MPE, right? So taking advantage of the push 3's MPE function, where you can slide notes into each other. Right? And again, filter, drive. We got a release time, so if we want it to sustain. Right? Turn on the LFO. Drive. Right? So you can play around with these sounds, get a lot of different ways to navigate it. Then I got my go-to effects, etc. Right? I might actually swap this one out for some more Middle Eastern instruments, but for now, this is what I got. Moving forward, so this is kind of melody. Right? This is another melody. Sometimes I use this one more for chords, but again, I got a sound bank with multiple different sounds. Turn that down a bit. Different sound. That's cool. Add some reverb. Right? Maybe a long decay time. Hold the sustain pedal. Hangs around. Right? So a bunch of effects that I can manipulate, play in real time, right? And this will kind of overlap with the melodic track, right? So we got some melody, some harmony. And then over here, I just have like random samples, organic samples that I'm looping that we can play around with. Get some overall psychedelic trippy sounds to perform and play, right? So that's just something extra I wanted to experiment with. If I find cool samples, I throw it in there and I can, add it to the mix. And then finally, I have a piano sound, right? Which I've been really digging. And Scalar 2 is a great tool as well to help you find chord progressions, help you find some vibes. If you're not feeling particularly creative or if you're hitting a wall, there's always something to get you out of the slump where you can keep going, right? So again, this is simple. I have the same effects here as I had on the other ones, and that's pretty much it. And then I have this crazy guitar looper setup, which is another thing I want to practice. And if you want to see how I've set that up, that's a whole other thing. I've made another video covering it in depth. I'll link it in the card above if you want to check it out. But with that, the only extra thing here is the control over the pans. Like I've mentioned, the sends, where on the APC40, you hold sends. I got send 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. So you can control all these sends. You can see on send 1, we got some here. And then user, you can map those to whatever. I don't have anything mapped right now. And then I have some controls mapped on the master. So if I go back over here and I show you Ableton, if I go to my master, I have Tornado plugin, which is cool. And the APC40 is mapped to these controls all the time. Okay, so that when I'm jamming, if I wanted to put some effects on the master, on everything, I can just touch this knob and it will always hit all of my tracks all the time, right? And then I have a fun little thing where I can randomize these things if I just want to like roll the dice and come up with new effects just to keep things fun, keep things interesting. Next, let's move on to number 3, which is practical tips to guide you to set up your own ultimate Ableton setup. And the first tip is to keep things simple. And this is going to be a contrast to what I've showed you. What I showed you was pretty complicated, and I've built this up over time. But to start out, you do not need to go crazy with this before starting to use it and starting to practice it, because it's in using it and in practicing it that you'll see what's working for you, what's not working for you, what could be added, what you feel like would be helpful. And if you're not taking direct action with your setup, you're going to be guessing, right? And you could just go down the rabbit hole of setting something up forever without actually practicing it. And it's through the practice that will give you the insights for what you need to do to tweak your setup to get it better and better. Okay, the only way I've gotten to the point of this crazy setup without getting sucked down a zillion rabbit holes is to keep things simple and iterate over time. Okay, and this is where a system comes in, because it keeps you focused on doing the minimum viable product of your setup and continuing to iterate over time. Okay, and it reminds you to keep reflecting. How is your setup going? Do we need to tweak something? Is it all good? Did something not work, etc.? And having that weekly review and that cycle to continue to look at your setup and tweak it over time gives you the insights for what you can do to make it better and better and better and ultimately build up something that's complex. But I would highly disencourage you, right, to try and set something up like this right off the bat. Just start super simple. You got your bass, melody, drums, harmony. That's good. You're good to go. And then play around with like one effect rack. Cool. see how it goes, jam it out, get some ideas. Then from there, try to see if you can get the same effect rack on another instrument, or maybe you want to tweak some effects and throw something else, jam it out, see what's up. And then maybe you're like, I'm not feeling this instrument too much. I want more variety. Let's do an instrument rack. Let's throw in more than one bass sound. You got 3 bass sounds now, right? And you start to build it up over time. And again, you do not need to go this crazy, okay? Oftentimes when I'm in a jam, I'm only using 2 to 3 of these tracks, maybe 4, right? So again, it does not have to be this crazy. And the more complex you make it, the more things that can go wrong, the harder it is on your CPU, and it just gets a little bit hairy, right? So if you keep things simple and just optimize something simple, it's going to work better than going super complicated. And also, you want to consider just work with what you've got, okay? You do not need fancy tools like I've got here, right? It took me a while to be able to find these tools and why I need them and save up the funds to invest in them and why I want to invest in them, right? But it doesn't make sense for you to go buy out a bunch of fancy stuff unless you know it's something you really need or really want and what it's going to do for you, right? And you can actually create a really advanced setup just with a simple MIDI controller and using your keyboard to map features in Ableton. Then if you want to upgrade to push or buy a specific piece of hardware that makes sense for you, then you can do so when you know exactly what you need it for, okay? And again, this will only become clear when you take action and find the limitations of your setup, which are like the little nooks and crannies that you'll only discover through taking action. And then those will yield the creative breakthroughs from your sessions. All right, just to show you real quick, if we go here inside Ableton, right, almost everything is MIDI mappable. Right? So if you have a MIDI controller, you can map any clip, you can map moving down a scene, you can map, arrangement view, MIDI overdub, arrangement arm, right? Arrangement recording, all this stuff can be MIDI mapped. So if you have a typical MIDI controller, right, you can map anything you want to that. So there's a lot of flexibility that you can get with a very small amount of tools. And if you don't have like a super advanced MIDI controller, or you want to use it mostly for an instrument and controlling effects, like what I got here, then you can totally use your keyboard controller, right? Because there's another mode in Ableton here, the key map, where again, you can map almost everything in Ableton that could be MIDI mapped to keys on your keyboard, right? So you could be like, okay, F1 is going to be session record. F2 is going to be scene down. F3 is going to be record to this clip slot. F4 is going to be turn on this delay, right? So you can really map things out without needing fancy gear and really dial it in. And so all that to say is, dude, you do not need to go crazy with gear. You can make a lot happen with very minimal amounts of gear. Okay. And for example, like I only discovered the Max for Live 1-button looper and this MC8 foot controller that I have for my guitar looper from finding the limitations in session view, trying to record audio to session view and being like, oh, you can't overdub with this. Okay, let's try Ableton's looper, Ableton's built-in looper. And then I found the limitations with that. I'm like, oh, it's really good for this, but I can't really adjust the layers afterwards. And then I tried my outboard gear that I already had for looping, like my Line 6 Helix and random guitar pedals. And then I tested it and you're like, this is cool. I like this. I don't like this. And then over time, you start to realize, okay, what are the things that you need, which narrows the gap of the hardware, the solutions, the software you need to get that going. If you're doing any kind of advanced mapping, you want to make sure to properly test the features as you make them. Okay, so if you're automating devices on and off, or you're changing stuff in your instrument racks, you want to make sure that you're saving yourself CPU, that it's working properly, right? And you're building out as you go, right? So if you're in Ableton here and you're setting stuff up, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to put Tornado on my master and I want my APC 40 to always be mapped, right? I want these controls to always be mapped to Tornado. Okay, so when you set that up, right, which you go here, you configure the controls, map it to macros, and you make sure that it syncs up, test it, make sure that this works, right? Make sure that, hey, when you go over here to another track, you can still control that Tornado plugin. Cool, right? Let's say you wanted to map something to this MIDI arrangement overdub, and you wanted to have a toggle for that, right? Well, test it out. Make sure that whatever key you map it to, in this case, let's go to key and let's map. All right, so let's just hit the 1 key for MIDI arrangement overdub, get out of here. Now test it. Cool. Now you know that works, right? I'm just going to delete that because I don't really need it, right? But again, as you're setting stuff up, like set it up, test it. If you're building an instrument rack and you're going into like over here, right? And you got an instrument rack with many different chains of instruments. Let's open it up. That's the arpeggiator. Let's get the instrument. There we go. So let's say you're building out an instrument rack here with multiple different instruments. Make sure to go here, find the instrument, and make sure that it works with this chain selector. Right? So now I can see that when I move this knob, it's selecting those chains and it's playing these different instruments, right? And test it, make sure it works as you go, and then save your work as you're building out your template. And once you have first version of your Ableton setup like this, you want to make sure to save it as a template or save it as a project and don't override it, right? So then every time you're making a new jam, just open up your template and then save it as a new project, jam out, come up with some ideas, see where it goes, rename it as whatever you want, a work in progress, right? And then make sure to leave your template untouched so that when you want to go back and make tweaks to it, you have that master template file or that master Ableton project that is your template, okay, that you do not override. And then you should be good to go to continue to iterate and build out your own setup. Now, this is only the first stage of my entire music making system. The next stage is flow, which is you're taking this setup of designed instruments, something that you've calibrated towards the musical direction you want to go. You're adding effects, you're making it playable, you're making it fun. Then the next step is to jam out a lot of ideas and get into flow. And there's a whole dimension of ways that you can develop your own way of flowing and improvising and coming up with ideas and staying in flow. And if you want to check out me demoing that process for you so that you can follow along, get some insights, and start flowing with your own setup, I highly encourage you to check out this video next. So I will see you in that video.